I'm here with the awesome Ensoniq TS-10, a great sounding synth from 1993 with a bunch of great features like the good quality wave samples, a great sequencer, EPS 16 Plus and ASR10 sample import and playback, and what the TS is probably best known for, Hyperwaves. And that's what we will have an in-depth look at in this video. Now, what is a hyperwave? A hyperwave is a wave list that can have as much as 16 wave samples in it, and each wave sample can have its own tuning, volume, duration. These wave samples then are played one after the other. Which waveforms are in the list is up to you. You can add any of the 254 internal waveforms to the list in any particular order. All this gives us a lot to play with, and what I want to show you is 5 different ways or 5 different perspectives of looking at hyperwaves. So number 1 is simulating Yamaha SY22 and 35 vector synthesis, simulating wavetable synthesis, creating evolving soundscapes and drones, rhythmic sounds, and other type of sounds. Now, to start programming a hyperwave, we will need to set things up in the TS-10, so let's do that first. Okay, I made a sound called Initial, and this is my go-to sound when I start programming. Basically, it's a sound set to a saw wave without any filters applied or anything. When we press the wave button, we can change the waveform category. Transwave is the last category in the list, and wave list is nowhere to be found, and that's correct. What we need to do now is changing the settings for the sound to wavelist so that we can make a hyperwave. So press the program control button, program control, and this will get us to the program type page. Here you can change the type from utility to hyperwave if you want. This is to define the sound category. Change the option none to wave list by highlighting it and pressing the arrow up button. Now choose wave list. Voices 5 and 6 in the sound will now be used up by the wave list, and this means that we only have 4 voices available in this sound, and that's okay. Now when we press the wave button and then the category button and scroll up, we will find the wave list. When we press a key, we will hear the hyperwave play through the factory settings, which is not very exciting. Before doing anything else, we will set both envelope 3 and envelope 2 to full on. Press the envelope 3 button and then the copy button. This will take you to the envelope copy paste and envelope presets page. Press default, scroll 1 page up to full on and press yes. And repeat this for envelope 2, so press envelope 2, press the copy button, and it will take us to the same page. When we press default, it's already on full on, and press yes. Now that both the filter envelope and amp envelope are set to full on, we can start programming the hyperwave. The Yamaha SY22 and SY35 that I have are both FM and vector synthesizers, and you can record the vector stick movement like this. and then save it as part of your preset. So let's simulate that on the TS-10. The motion on the SY35 was from element A to B, back to A, then to C, from C to D, and then back to A. So we will use 6 steps in the Hyperwave, each step representing one motion or vector in the sound. Press the wave button and set loop start to 6 and set end to 6. With these settings, the Hyperwave will start playing at step 1, play through to step 6, and will start looping at step 6. Press the select voice button and then edit wave list, and here's where the fun starts. So let's set step 1 to folk flute, set the sample start for each step to 99, so the sample starts beyond the attack part of the sound. Step 2, set it to tuba and sample start to 99. Step 3 to folk flute, sample start to 99, same as step 1. Step 4 to choir, sample start to 99. Step 5 to synth fox, sample start to 99. And step 6, again folk flute, same as step 1 and step 3, and sample start to 99. The Hyperwave now sounds like this. I don't quite like the way that sounds, so let's transpose the folk flute down 12 notes. Press the pitch button and set the transpose to -12. Go to step 3 and set transpose to -12. And step 5 to +12. And press the exit button. Now let's hear the result. It sounds much better, but a little bit too fast for my taste. So let's tweak the duration for each step. So press the time button. And step 1, set the duration to 600 and the crossfade time to 600. Step 2, set duration to 900 and crossfade time to 900. Step 3, set the duration to 600 and the crossfade time to 600. Step 4, set the duration to 900 and crossfade time to 900. Step 5, set the duration to 900 and crossfade time to 900. And step 6, set the duration to 300 and the crossfade time to 300. Now when we play a few notes, you will hear the sound move through the vectors once, then loop the sound at the end of the last vector, just like on the SY35. On the TS-10 we can make it a little bit more exciting though, so press the wave button again. Now instead of having the loop start at 6, just set the loop start at 1, so it will play the sound from beginning to end through all the vectors, and then start at the beginning again. Now if you use this as the starting point of your sound and you add some filters to it and envelopes and add some effects, you can make something like this. While playing around with the crossfade times in the Hyperwave, I noticed something. If we use only the crossfade time and no regular duration, the samples from each step seem to blend more into one another, especially when setting the crossfade depth to 6 dB. The Hyperwave now sounds somewhat like it's scanning through a wavetable or transwave, creating some harmonic changes over time. Check this out. Now we need to realize that in a wavetable or transwave, we have control over each single cycle in the wavetable or transwave. In a Hyperwave, that is not the case, but nevertheless, we can do some nice stuff. Like I said, we're simulating, so let's take a look at how this sound that I called Wavetable 1 was set up. First of all, it starts at step 1 and it ends at step 16 and starts looping at step 1, so it uses all 16 steps in the Hyperwave. The list contains sine wave, triangle wave, saw wave, organ wave, pad waves, analog waves, bell waves, which is a trance wave, synth bell, organ wave again, soprano sax 2, alto sax, tenor sax, and an electric bass. It doesn't matter, you can use anything you want. The duration is all set to a crossfade of 300, no regular duration, and a depth of 6 dB. And here and there I adjusted the volume of an individual step. Okay, let's move to this sound, Wavetable 2. Wavetable 2 uses the same Hyperwave as the Wavetable 1 example, but I set up different voices with modulations. So we start with voice number 3, and if we look in the wave list for this voice, then you can see that it only uses step 11 from the Hyperwave. It starts at 11, ends at 11, and loops at 11. It sounds like this. Now, one thing you can do is to modulate the end step with the mod wheel. If we go to the next page in the wave page, then you can see what I mean. The modulation destination is set to end step. The mod source is set to wheel, and the mod amount is set to +5. There are 16 steps in the wave list or Hyperwave, so modulating with an amount of +5 and starting at 11 will result in the end step being 16 when the mod wheel is fully up. So check this out. Voice 1 is using step 1 through step 8 from this Hyperwave. The loop start is set to step 1, so it will keep looping from step 1 to step 8. There's already some pitch modulation applied, so let's listen to how it sounds now. Now let's set up some modulation in the wave list. In this case, let's set up the modulation destination to loop start point and set the mod source to mixer and the mod amount to 7. That means that the loop will be modulated between steps 1 and 8. The mixer consists of envelope 2 and the LFO, and yeah, listen to this. For the next example, I made a combination of voice 2 and 4. Voice 2 is using steps 9 through 16, and voice 4 is using steps 5 through 12 of the Hyperwave. Both voices now have the start step and the loop start being modulated by the LFO. And also voice 4 is transposed 12 notes up. And another thing I did is it has a delayed start. So if you're looking to do evolving soundscapes or a drone, these are actually easy to do. If you want more randomness to the sound and have it not sound like it's repeating all the time, then we can give each step in the Hyperwave a different duration and crossfade time. Besides that, we can also add more randomness by assigning a modulator to the start plus loop. Let's look at the sound you're hearing at the moment. Voice 1 is the main sound and it's only using 5 steps, but with very different time settings for duration and crossfade. Also the filters and envelopes are set to repeat, so even when you hear the same wave sample from the Hyperwave, it might sound different because of the filters and envelopes, which gives more randomness to the sound. The continuing sound in the background is voice 2, which only loops from step 9 through 12, and it gives some sense of rhythm or continuity to the sound, I think. Voice 3 is using step 13 through 16 for the drum loop. The next example sound is a little bit deeper, and it uses all 16 steps of the Hyperwave. Some steps are very long, some are very short, creating sort of glitches in the sound. And while the sound is playing, I will scroll through the list so you can see how it's made up. Or if you want to make it a bit more weird, you can do stuff like this. Wave sequencing was and still is a very popular way of sound synthesis. You can also do some really nice and interesting rhythmic stuff or sounds with it. In the example that you're hearing right now, I used both percussive and sustaining sounds, each with a duration of 300 milliseconds and no crossfade, which creates this steady industrial type of loop. Now, let's see what else we can do. In this example, Hyperwave Funk, I started out with the same Hyperwave as the one you just heard, but I exchanged a few steps with a kick and a snare sound, so now it becomes a drum loop. This sound is using all 16 steps of the Hyperwave. Then voice 2 is also using all 16 steps, but I assigned noise to modulate the start plus loop point. I also transposed it up 1 octave and gave it a 500 milliseconds delayed playback time. Voice 3 is playing steps 10 through 12 with the filter set up in such a way that it sounds like it's actually playing forwards and backwards. And voice 4 is playing just step 10, which is the synth fox sound. And together they sound like this. The next sound that I programmed, Interstellar, for demonstration purposes I lowered the tempo of the sound by using the program rate parameter. I started with this sound by randomly choosing waveforms until I found something that I liked. At first I only used 8 steps of the Hyperwave, but then I also changed the timing of some of the steps to 16th notes relative to the other steps. Then to get a full measure of 4 beats, I needed to add steps 9 and 10 to the sequence, of course. That means we still have 6 unused steps in the Hyperwave. I used those steps in the other voices. When we speed it up again and switch on all voices, it sounds like this. Of course, we could also just use one wave sample on, for example, 4 steps and then set up timing and volume for each step to something like this. So we get a rhythmic pattern with, for instance, just a saw wave. Then adjust the filter settings and add some beats using the other 3 voices and create something like this. Okay, another techno type of example just for fun. Voice 1 is this fast techno loop. And then on voice 4 I programmed some snare drums to go with that. Then voice 2 is the 4 to the floor kick. And voice 3 is the hi-hat. And it uses step 13, and I set up the modulation destination to loop start, and the mod source to wheel, and a modulation amount of 3. Then in the wave list I set step 14, 15 and 16 to play different hi-hats. So when I move the mod wheel I can switch between 4 different hi-hats. Here we go. Okay, the previous 4 methods, of course, are just perspectives or different angles on how to look at hyperwaves. No matter what kind of sound we program with the hyperwaves, in the end, it's all wave sequencing what we're doing. Let's see what else we can do with hyperwaves. One of the simplest applications to use a hyperwave is for creating a tempo-based delay without using the effect section. This bass sound is using just one step in the hyperwave with a duration of 384 milliseconds. Of course, think about giving envelope 3 enough release time. Another nice thing that we can do in a hyperwave, which is not possible when we use the regular version of, for example, this bass sound, is that we can adjust the start position of the wave sample. When we set the start point to 24 of this bass sound, for instance, it sounds much more usable to me. And we didn't even have to use the filter to accomplish this. Let's stick with that idea of creating a tempo-based delay But now instead of using just one step of the hyperwave, let's use 8 steps and let's give each step a different waveform. Each step has a duration of 48 milliseconds and a crossfade time of 48 milliseconds. So each step is 96 milliseconds. Multiply this by 8 steps and the loop or the sound has a total duration of 768 milliseconds. I already showed you that in the Hyperwave menu we can adjust the sample start point. Now this is very useful. In the first place, what you could do is set up, for example, 8 steps, each with the same trance wave, and give each step a different start value. Now each step will play a different location of the trance wave. By doing this, we can create a sort of time-synced sample and hold effect like this. Another example is this Wavesample Analog Bass 2. When we make an arpeggio of 4 notes like this, and then set different start times for each step like this. Step 4, 35, Step 5, 22, Step 6, 0, 3, and Step 7 on 0, 8. We get a much nicer sounding arpeggio. Add to that an LFO and some more elements with the other 3 voices and we'll have a very nice sound altogether. In most of the examples in this video, I only use the Hyperwave for all the voices in the sound. Of course, we can also use the Hyperwave in combination with the regular wave samples. We can create, for example, a voice that has an arpeggiated sound with a voice that uses a lead sound and add some noise to that, and yeah, you get something like this. Ensoniq did not make a button on the TS that lets you instantly sync a hyperwave to the tempo of the internal sequencer or external MIDI clock. However, as you can hear, it's very well possible to have the hyperwave sync to tempo. The drums you just heard in the opening track here were all coming from the hyperwave and recorded in the sequencer by holding the keys for the drums for the full 4 measures. The bass sound I was playing also comes from the hyperwave and is in sync with the sequencer tempo. How? Okay. The TS does not work with note values like quarter note, 8th note or 16th notes. Instead, it works with step length values in milliseconds. Each adjustment that we make to the step length value is in steps of 12 milliseconds. To make a hyperwave sync with tempo, we first need to know the BPM. So let's do a BPM calculation. For example, each step in the hyperwave is 600 milliseconds. 1 minute has 60 seconds or 60,000 milliseconds. When we divide 60,000 by 600, we get a BPM of 100 as the result. Now that we know that, let's start programming this thing. Let's start with a kick on step 1 on each beat with a length of 600 milliseconds. So 600 milliseconds represents a quarter note in relation to a 4/4 time signature at 100 BPM. That means in this case that an 8th note should have a value of 300 milliseconds, half that of a quarter note. So let's put some hi-hats on those 8th notes using step 15 and 16. 15 is a closed hi-hat and 16 is an open hi-hat, both with a value of 300 milliseconds. Good. Now let's make a 4-note bass line using steps 3, 4, 5 and 6. And let's have it play 16th notes. Now that's easy. 16th notes are twice as fast as 8th notes, so their value in milliseconds, in our case here, should be 150 milliseconds each. And here's where the TS gets kind of confusing. As you can see, there is no value of 150 milliseconds. There is 144 milliseconds and 156 milliseconds. If we give all 16th notes a value of 144 milliseconds, the bassline pattern will be too fast. If we give all 16th notes a value of 156 milliseconds, the bassline pattern will be too slow. But if we give one step a value of 144 milliseconds and the other a value of 156 milliseconds, then together their duration equals 300 milliseconds, an 8th note, which works out just fine. So let's set up step 3 to 144, step 4 to 156, step 5 to 156, and step 6 to 144. For voice 4, I did the same trick, but added 30-second notes for percussion at steps 7 through 10. I set step 7 to 72 milliseconds, step 8 to 84 milliseconds, step 9 to 60 milliseconds, and step 10 to 84 milliseconds. These together also equals 300 milliseconds. And when you hear it, it sounds like 16th notes, but they really are 30-second notes. I shortened the wave sample on step 8 and 10 by using the sample start. And when you put them all together, now, does this all sync to the internal tempo or MIDI clock? Yes. I already recorded it in the sequencer for 4 bars, and I will play that for you. When you're working on a project on a specific BPM and want to use a hyperwave and sync it to your project, then we can turn the BPM calculation around to find out what values to use for the steps. Say that you are working on a project at 82 BPM. Let's calculate again. In the TS, there is no step value of 731.70, so we will use the nearest value to that, which is 732 milliseconds. So a quarter note at a BPM of 82 has a length of 732 milliseconds in the TS. In this example, I added 2 eighth notes, one with a value of 360 and the other with a value of 372 milliseconds, which added together is also 732 milliseconds. This is where the TS is a little weird again, but when you use these calculations and use the nearest values, it will work. Okay, that's it for this video on hyperwaves. I hope you have gained some more insights into working with hyperwaves. It takes some time to get the hang of it, and time to program, but I really think it's fun to do that. For now, take care and see you in the next video.